Before I get started, I will jump into a couple of quick things. I've got an agenda of various items we're going to cover today. Obviously, if there's a question, hop up, heckle, ask, whatever. Happy to take a small detour here or there. If it's a real involved answer, I'll probably push it off to the end. But I always like to start with a couple of items. And one of the things that I want you to think about today as we go through this is how do you select technologies and how do you verify the things that you've selected that are going to be appropriate, right? How do you guide yourself as things are going on in and around the organizations that you work in? And I always equate it to being in the wilderness. And one of the things that I like to do is go backpacking. And you get a map and a compass, and you have to know how to use those tools to effectively not get lost. So I'm sure there's a few of you who know how to use a map and a compass, and those who don't. If you're one of the ones who don't, you better hope that if you're stuck in the wilderness, you're with somebody who does, or you're going to starve to death and die. So we'll leave you with that to think about. If you don't know how to use a map and a compass, come find me afterwards. We'll have a quick conversation. All right, let's have some conversations about the reduction of browser engines. So if you roll back to the late 90s, early 2000s, we had a lot of choices in browsers. There was a version of a browser made by various groups, whether it was Mozilla or Apple in some cases, or open source engines, or eventually Chrome. All of those things started to consolidate over the past, let's say, decade. And one of the things that's left us with is very few choices in browsers, and ultimately a disproportionate market share. And so if I look at current market share on just North America is all I pulled the stats for, but globally it changes a little bit. One of the things that jumps out to me is that you've got Chrome and Chrome Lite being Edge, right? Those are really just the same browser these days. And those take the vast majority of the market share. So any exploit that ends up in your browser is going to affect a very wide population. And that's a problem from like a population health statistic. It's probably worse when we get to the mobile side of the house. But as you look at the other choices on that list, you really only have a couple of choices outside of Chrome or versions of Chrome. And largely that's Safari if you're on a Mac, or Firefox if you're on kind of everything else. And those all have to compete against the same standards and the same infrastructure and the choices that you make. So as you've built out the choices in browsers, one of the things I'm going to do today is really focus on Chrome as the model, because ultimately that's what the market share is largely built upon. And so when I talk about browser extensions, you can extrapolate this to all of them because they all have the same basic rules, but from the specific examples, I'm going to focus largely on Chrome. When we go to mobile, the problem is opaque at best. So it's nice to think that you're running something other than Safari if you're on iOS, but you're not. Unfortunately, all of the browser versions that run on iOS have to use the Safari browser renderer. They're not allowed to include their own. So if you've put Chrome on your iOS device, you're really running Safari. You're not really running Chrome, just as a side note. So the vulnerabilities or the exploits that are capable on iOS are, in general, capable across almost all of the browser frameworks if they're part of the WebKit components. And then, obviously, if you're on Android, you have a lot more choices, but what it looks like is nearly everybody chooses Chrome. So why do we care about the reduction of browser engines? Well, historically, what that's meant for us is vulnerabilities have a broader applicability to us, right? A single vulnerability can be detrimental across our organization without an ecosystem of multiple browsers. So reduced immunity with reduced choice is one of the things that, that we look at. And then ultimately, you have a much stronger reliance on a single vendor. And I'm not a huge fan of single vendor reliance as we look at this stuff. And as we dig into the next 35 minutes or so on the browser extension side, you'll see largely why. All right, now for the fun stuff. Okay, browser extensions. I'm going to start with the quick primer on the browser extension. When you go to build a browser extension, they all have the same basic components to them. Every browser extension has essentially a manifest file, some JavaScript, occasionally machine binaries are included in it, and you can either decide to sideload them or they can be installed through a store, right? So if I think about what each of those does, each of them has a unique purpose and a unique area where they're problematic. The manifest files we're going to cover in detail because those are important, as is JavaScript and the others. But the first big problem that you run into in the browser extension world is security is at the option of the developer. I am not a big fan of that. So you have millions of extensions at this point. Some of them come from the Google Store, some of them come from other stores, some of them are just downloaded and installed, some of them have no update server at all, so we don't know where they really come from, or how they really got there. And the security is decided by the person that wrote the extension. It's not, there is no default enforcement in the browser to determine what's good or bad or what you're allowed to do or not do. So by and large, you're trusting the reputation of who downloaded it and how they rated it in a store. So that's problematic at best. Who's to say that the ad blocker you downloaded is trustworthy because 100 million people downloaded it? That's probably not a good enough reason because the vast majority of those people have no idea what they downloaded or why. It's just popular. So that's the first problem, is security is the option of the developer. Now, internal to Google, this is a screenshot of part of their developer site. If you can spot the spelling mistake, good for you, but it is part of theirs, not mine. So just a screenshot, I didn't write it. They are working on a new browser manifest file, policy. So essentially what they're saying is that after the expiration of the current policy in 2024, we're going to remove the extensions from the store, but if they're still installed on your environment, they're still going to operate and run. And if they've changed the update location prior to January 2024, they'll just continue to get updates outside of what's supported. So somewhat problematic on the manifest versions, but there are at least a view of, hey, this might be a problem and we should do some stuff around it. So when I dig into this, what does the browser manifest do? So every extension has a manifest file. It has to, and they're in the app data location wherever your extensions are stored. There's generally a long string that you can go find. The extensions are always stored the same way. There is a GUID and a version, and then the code underneath it. And underneath that root directories, there's going to be a manifest file. Inside that manifest file declares all the options that this extension has rights to. So the first things that you can think about from a manifest file is, what I'm allowed to do to your interface on the Chrome browser. So in the manifest file, I can determine if I'm allowed to customize or change that user interface in any way that I want. I can deal with observed and content settings. And what those really mean is, what am I allowed to do with the traffic that comes through the browser, and what am I allowed to interact with? And each of these are like statements that are made in a manifest file. So when I get to the blue side of the house, we'll talk a little bit about how to deal with some of this. But from the attack side of the house, there are a bunch of dangerous settings. Things like all URLs. And what all URLs really means is I'm allowed to intercept everything from every site in every protocol. It doesn't really mean URLs. It means all protocols that are supported on Chrome. And that's problematic. There is other instances where you can specify like HTTP star and take everything that comes from HTTP, or HTTPS star and take everything that comes from HTTPS. In general, when you're looking at a manifest file, the things that you want to think about and the things that you want to concentrate on is, where is this extension allowed to communicate with? What is it allowed to inspect? If you're running an extension that is there to, deal with some component that you care about in your business, and there are very few that I would think, but maybe like a password safe or others, you probably need somewhat excessive rights for that to function, because it does have to interject itself onto every web page. If you're looking at an ad blocker, for instance, or you're looking at an extension that is there to interact with your bank, it probably should only be able to associate itself to the domains that it owns and that it operates. And if it has a wider setting than that, that should throw off some issues or some things to look at. Beyond that, there's also the settings of whether in content or observed is whether it's allowed to read your history in your browser, whether it can read the internet cache, if it's allowed to interact with various sites. Can it read your geolocations, your management attributes? All of those things are sort of observed settings that are allowed inside the browser extension. So when you think of all of the things that have shifted today to running in the browser, and then you're saying, okay, anybody that writes a browser extension is allowed to interact in almost any way with the browser, that's a lot of control. The other things we see that are in manifest files that worry us beyond things like geolocation, history, cache, unlimited storage, access to all protocols, right? Those are all of the kind of the big ones. But there's also things like camera control and sort of anything that your browser is allowed to do. And then finally, it's able to say, hey, I can interact with tabs, and I can interact and run in the background whether you want me on or not. Probably not good. So when you look at the manifest file, that's always the first thing that should throw you off on is this thing okay or not, is what are the permissions, what are the restrictions? Now, you go a next layer down, and every browser extension is largely built on either JavaScript in combination with binaries or just JavaScript on its own. And unfortunately, when we start to look at these things, endpoint protection is useless in this. And I mean utterly useless. It's bad enough to think that your endpoint protection on a standard binary's got roughly a 9 to 50% efficacy rates, the best being about 50% of known problems in just standard OS stuff. But when we get down to browser extensions, you'll see it's pretty ugly. It's a grim situation because they're not really processing obfuscated script libraries. They're not really processing the JavaScript components. They're not looking at the manifest file to determine risk. They're not looking at the machine binaries because they're ELF encoded and they don't know how to read those. There's a whole bunch of reasons that all these things sort of roll together. So when we look at a browser extension, the first thing we look for is obfuscated scripts. If you're a developer and you've gone through the trouble of double or triple encoding your script with UU encode, or dumped it into hex, or you changed every variable in the JavaScript to some hexadecimal identifier, chances are you're up to no good, right? That's a real good indicator or start for what's problematic. The second thing, and obfuscated scripts, unfortunately, are pretty common. You've got some common ones out there, like there's a browser extension for coupons called Honey. Just call it what it is it's a giant data vacuum to monitor all of your browsing on the internet. In exchange, they give you coupons. Is that okay on a corporately run machine? God, I hope not. I really do. That's a disaster. Citibank has one also that's not developed by Citibank. It's developed by Rakuten? I can't remember. And same thing. It's just giant obfuscated JavaScript to suck all the data off your computer. That's probably not what you want in your personal life. It's definitely not what you want in your corporate environments. Right? So heavy control of your browser extensions is one of the things I want you to take away from this. But if you're doing the investigation of these to determine good for bad, really simple. Look at the manifest to start with. Look at the obfuscation to see if there's, if there is obfuscation in there. A copy of visual code and a plugin for Beautify to undo all the JavaScript variables will go a long way very quickly to tell you what you're looking at. Once you're beyond that, it starts to get a little bit more complex. And one of those things is vulnerable libraries, because you can have a browser plugin that includes a vulnerable JavaScript library that now increases the risk of your browsing capabilities and increases the risk on your overall machine simply by having a plugin installed. And if it's running in the background and you have a vulnerable library there are vectors now to take over and deal with your machine in unforeseen or inappropriate ways. So when we start to look at the browser extensions, JavaScript is not great, right? There's some problems in there. It takes a lot to dig into it and look at it. And then third, JavaScript can be loaded from remote sources in your browser extension. So if you're kind of a lazy developer and you didn't quite finish that function to run on-prem on your browser extension, or you really wanted to hide what's going on, you just make remote calls to your JavaScript after the fact, and you can update the targets, you can do bad things, you can change your running code. Sort of anything you want to do can now happen in the browser. I can't go in and easily change my manifest file without producing a new version and a new update, but I definitely can change the code that I'm running and the operations it's under. And if I started with a really, really open manifest file, I can now do horrific things with a computer browser at this point. So, covered manifest files, covered JavaScript, and now we get to binaries. So you're allowed to, as part of your browser extension, you're allowed to take compiled binaries and run them natively on the machines. And the way they do it is they compile them sort of like an ELF binary for Linux. They wrap them in a wrapper so that the browser can run it. And then you produce one for Mac and Linux and Windows so you have native machine code running. Problem is it's sitting inside the browser and it's sitting inside the sandbox of the browser. But because the browser has such extreme rights now to everything you do, it's not really fair to say that the browser is really a sandbox, because at this point it's really become its own operating system. They're large enough now to run sort of everything you do day to day. So now you have all these unchecked binaries with executable privileges running on the machine inside the browser that can make whatever calls they want, right? Can't cover everything at an OS level, but you can do a lot of bad things inside the browser with binaries. And EPP ignores these. They don't know what to do with them. So you're running blind inside your browser with this. The other thing about browser extensions is propagation happens outside the store. And this is one of the things that we're seeing a lot of. And I'm going to show some examples of this here in a couple of minutes and look at the propagation and how it works. But you do not have to propagate a browser extension inside the Google Store. And in fact, roughly 35% of the browser extensions that we see don't have a store affiliation. So if you're looking at online sources or trying to go to the store to find the GUID that's there, you'll often come up empty-handed. And I'll explain why in a little bit. We'll get into some of that. Okay. So we talked about manifest files. I just want to make sure I reiterate a couple of items before we move on. So the first piece that I want to reiterate is the rules are dictated by the developer. I am not a fan of that. I do not like when I create a program and the rules are dictated on security by the developer. It just leaves way too much open. And I know that that happens a lot in our world, and that there's a lot of programs that the rules are dictated by the developer, but this is just one more option for unsafe areas where you don't have a lot of coverage or protection. And then two, manifest files have a lot of unsafe options. So if I had to estimate, there's probably 70 to 80 various manifest options that are pretty typical in an environment that we see, and about 25 of them I would consider unsafe. Right, so when we're scanning environments looking in that space, those unsafe options are the first thing I look for. So now I'm going to move on, a couple of fun examples. All right, so I run a small SOC as a service that's built for the down market MSPs, right? So groups that operate essentially MSPs through this country. And largely North America, a little bit of Europe, but I've got about 1,100 MSPs today that we provide SOC services for. And one of the things that that's given us is an unbelievable reach on the data set. They load up agents into their little customers, and we capture things like asset inventory. And one of the things that we capture as part of our service is browser extensions. So this whole talk came out of us having access to millions of browser extensions and doing analysis on that world over the past 3.5 years. That's been a huge chunk of my work and my time. And this is a fun one. So this is a browser extension that goes by 61 different unique names. And it all does basically the same thing, which is steal your data. So every one of these, I'll give you some of the numbers by default. Every one of these is a unique extension identifier. So 61 unique names in the extension. Every one of them was sideloaded. They all showed up from somewhere else. Now, one of the problems is I can't always tell after the fact where it came from. If it has an update URL to it as part of the manifest metadata, then I have a lot better idea of where it came from or how it got there. But this one had 61 unique extensions to it. Most of them had the word PDF converter in it, or search manager or things of that nature embedded in it. And let's be honest, if you have a browser extension that is called PDF converter or video converter, it's malware. Like, we don't have to look any further. It's malware. Like, there is no version out there that you need to run as an extension. If it has the word ad blocking in there, well, that's a data vacuum. It's just taking data from you. I don't care whose it is. I don't care how trustworthy you think they are. That's probably a bad thing to be running. So a lot of these very popular extensions that we run into have some really ugly consequences to them. So 61 unique identifiers. This thing was connected to 27 different unique domain names. All various kinds of like proxy this, run this, search group this. They must have had 15 different PDF domains that they were running off of. And really behind the scenes, what this was doing was collecting your browser data and shipping it off to a third party. So when we broke apart all of the JavaScript and looked at it, essentially what they were doing was tracking everything you did in your browser and pick it up and push it out the door and say, okay, great, we're in good shape, we have all of their data. And it was an enormous amount of data that was getting leaked off of machines. I still see this in the wild every single day. So every single day I see organizations that are still infected with this. It is still ongoing and still operating. It is definitely problematic. Last week, I had another fun one. Had a crypto theft financial services theft browser extension. This one was interesting in that we got the dropper and the initial source on part of this because we found it because of the dropper, not because of the browser extension initially. So, infected via PowerShell, the initial file was running a PowerShell script that downloaded a dropper file. So we took that PowerShell script and we said, all right, well, let's throw that in VirusTotal. That's how many people caught it. That's not good. This is what the script looked like. That's suspicious. PowerShell should not just be all numbers and a double decode at the end. In general, that means it's bad. After it took the dropper file down, the dropper file then ran, and we took that dropper file. This is how many of your endpoint protection catches that one, another PowerShell file. 0. Probably not a good thing. And what that dropper file did was to create another PowerShell file to run, which is what we see here on this one. And the important bits in this is a convert to hex new GUI with a byte array at the top and a bunch of letters. Really, really interesting. What they were doing was randomly generating a GUID every time this thing ran to sideload a new Chrome extension into the environment. So single PowerShell file to pull another PowerShell file to create a browser extension on the fly by pulling down a pack file, which I loved the spelling of in there, but that's another story, in order to build a custom browser extension. If your browser extension is entirely in hex, you're screwed. Like, this is not what it should look like. That is not a good day. So when you go from PowerShell file that pulls PowerShell file that pulls and it builds another side-loaded browser extension, you probably have an issue. What this extension did was steal financial services passwords and crypto wallets. That's what it was built for. Anybody want to know how it showed up in the browser, what it looked like? Because this is the best part of this. It's Google Sheets. That was the icon they had. I mean, like, not bad. I mean, not great the way it was written. Not incredibly hard to find, but super painful that your endpoint protection can't see a PowerShell file that's clearly bad, operating in ways that are not good, downloading another file that is clearly up to no good, injecting itself into your browser directory, and then the browser extension itself was filled with all kinds of stuff that was ugly. But the primary mechanism was to steal crypto wallets and to steal financial services passwords and ship those off to third-party domains. Needless to say, the domain that it would ship it off to was a proxy domain with a .xyz. I think at this point we can all agree, let's just start blocking .xyz. I've yet to find the use case where those domain names from a top-level domain are legitimate. If somebody's got a couple, I'd love to hear it, but I'm guessing most of us in the room that do investigations and that spend our time looking at domain names, your investigation comes to a very quick halt when you see .xyz. You're like, all right, I'm done. I got enough info. Let's kill this thing off. I mentioned this to the domain tools guys. They laughed and they said, those guys are trying to make it look better these days. They're trying to knock down. I'm like, that's like a game of whack-a-mole, though. Like, that's just not happening. So that's the red team side, what we see every day. If you're on the blue team side, what do you do? Okay. So you got to start by looking for side-loaded extensions. That's the first thing you do. Because any side-loaded extension should bring about investigation and discovery. And unfortunately, you can't just simply plug a GUID side-loaded extension into one of the open source intelligence groups and say, is this good or not, right? We're always happy to share threat intel on what we see and extensions we have. come chat with me after if we want to talk about that, because I'm always happy to help the community out in that space. But ultimately, side-loaded extensions are where you have to start, and you need a big database of them. And knowing that a lot of the malware is using random GUIDs, it's even more appropriate that once you know that it's side-loaded, it doesn't matter as much what the GUID is. It matters that it doesn't have provenance from where it came from or where it's getting updated from, or the update's in a bad location. Right? So that's one of the things that we look at. The second is we look for anything with permissions that seems excessive. Unfortunately, you're going to run into a lot of stuff that is legitimate where it's just lazy development efforts, and I'll show a couple examples of those in a minute, but lazy development efforts that have caused a lot of problems in that space, and that's a problem. And then ultimately, you need to be looking at fake names on extensions. Google doesn't put out side-loaded extensions with the name Google in it. So if you see that, you got a problem. Now, Microsoft does, though. So you can't just assume that the Microsoft Outlook extension that didn't come from a store is bad, because they do put out a side-loaded extension for Microsoft Outlook that goes into the Chrome browser. And it gets installed if you choose the special options when you're installing Office 365. So there are legitimate cases when those happen and when they don't. It's not an all or nothing, but that should start the investigation. So definitely fake names and check GUIDs and work on that. And then vulnerabilities and extensions, like JS Retire is a good one out there to run your browser extensions once you've pulled them down through. Now we'll play a little game here. All right, can we spot the fake browser extension? This is the virus total checker for virus checker for downloads and virus total. Ignore the highlighting, but can you spot the fake one? It's a trick question. They're all fake. Virus total up until recently didn't actually produce a browser extension. They were all community supported. And you're trusting that the community member did good things, not bad things, when they built their extension. None of those are from the vendor, though. Those are all different ones. And two of those are side-loaded. Like, a side-loaded virus total extension does worry me, especially when you're talking about this came from a small market SMB customer. Probably not legit. Okay, so if I'm looking at what I need to look for again, and I know that I've got a problem with side-loaded extensions, anything with permissions that seem excessive, fake names, vulnerabilities, and extensions. So here's a couple examples of kind of what we see out in the marketplace. So the top one, that's a PDF viewer, as we talked about before. Probably not so good. Makes requests. Oh, it can block your requests. So you make a request and it's like, no, you didn't mean that. Just smack it down, block it, and put its own request in its place. That is definitely a permission they give you as part of the manifest files. And that one has access to all your storage also. So, pretty good. And all URLs does not mean URLs, it means all protocols. Below it, you have one called Relay. I love that Relay comes from a janky S3 bucket with unknown provenance. That is where it gets its update from. And it can do things like make requests, talk to all URLs, communicate with anything HTTP, which is a redundant permission to the all URLs, so it's clear that they didn't really have a clear handle on what those things were. Runs in the background, can interact with tabs, storage, history, web request blocking, can read your identity, your email, your management attributes, and all your enterprise device attributes. Seems excessive for a browser extension that is updated from an S3 bucket. I think most people would probably agree with that. And then there's another one called Content Provider that comes off the local host for an update. I don't even know where to begin with that one, which means that there's another binary running on the system that's going to update itself and put an XML file out so that it can download a new browser extension side-loaded. That one seems like a lot of work, but it's not uncommon. I love that it's out of the Windows directory also. That's another thing that I really like in a browser extension, is that the XML file lives in Windows. This is 3 brief examples of stuff that we run into every single day in spades. I mean, it is constant, just constant. Thousands and thousands and thousands of blacklisted extensions, and this seems to be the very soft, squishy target for crime and for data theft and for exploitation of your data. So back down to, all right, let's talk vulnerabilities and extensions. This is the Adobe Acrobat official PDF reader, 3 CVEs that go back to 2019, unfixed, current. It also has permissions to block your request, read your downloads, talk to all URLs, make requests on your behalf, and interact with all the native messaging components. Oh, and it can talk to all your tabs. And it's got 3 vulnerabilities in it. Probably not okay. If I was in a corporate situation, it's hard for me to say blacklist the Adobe Acrobat extension, but I'll tell you in my organization it is blacklisted. It is not allowed. And it's not allowed because these things still exist. And if you haven't fixed 2019 CVEs, you're probably not really paying attention to this browser extension. You're probably not actively developing on it. So I've got a few minutes left. What can we do? All right. So number 1, there's some open source tooling, right? So if I want to find browser extension, there's open source tooling and there's commercial tooling. On the open source stuff, you're probably hard pressed to beat something like OS Query. Quite honestly, it's easy, it's fast, it can pick up browser extensions, tell you what's there, give you permissions, run commands for you. It's reasonable in that space. In the commercial tooling to find browser extensions, it's a little harder. There's not as much out there. There are enterprise browsers like Talon that are out there that are building commercial tools to control what extensions go into an environment, but less about the discovery. Your best bet on the commercial side is going to be things like Tanium, right? Their ability to query the OS and pull that data is probably the easiest way to find browser extensions in an environment, or other systems management level tools. It's less about having a threat hunting tool or less about having some specific logs, and it's more about having your asset inventory in a consumable way. And if you're going to build asset inventory, it should be lifecycle related data, meaning that I never delete what was changed. I only track what's new. And so as time goes on, you have this long running tail of the assets, software assets in your environment that used to exist and that currently exist. And current is way up at the front, and used to shows you when everything changed. Right? So when I think about some of the stuff we have to do to resolve these problems, one of them is I need to track the lifespan of a browser extension, and I need to track every time it changes, because when a new version of it comes out, I need to compare it to the last version to say what changed. Did they update their manifest file? Did they do horrible things? Did they change and make it more more risk involved in it, or did they make it better? Did they actually tighten down the rules and make it less risky for me? Right, so when we look at kind of the tooling in this space, long-running asset inventory that's got like the full life cycle of changes indefinitely, never deletes, is one of the key things in this space. You got to be able to check GUIDs quickly, and the GUID is simply the easiest way to find that is in the directory structure of where the extensions live. Right? So when you get to the extensions, there'll be a whole bunch of GUIDs listed there, and they're all directories. And you basically take that list and you use that to go check them. And then vulnerabilities in the tooling are pretty straightforward to look at. From a Really hard from a compiled executable perspective, pretty easy from a JavaScript perspective. Something like JS retire is probably the appropriate thing to be thinking about, because then you can take the browser extension, pump it through JS retire, and it'll print out, here are the 5 vulnerabilities it has in the JavaScript libraries that it's running. And that'll give you a pretty good idea of whether this stuff is still operating or not and what it looks like. So ultimately, those are kind of the overarching themes when we look at browser extensions and what we're up against and where we're at. I left 5 minutes left. If people have questions, I will take some of those now. Yes?
Are you working, great research, there's a lot of research out there. Are you working with EDR vendors who are offering scanning of those?
So the question was, am I working with the EDR vendors to improve the research of scanning of those extensions? Unfortunately, they're not so interested in it. They haven't really gotten to a point of looking at that stuff. We have relationships with a couple of them where they look at the data and they say, it's interesting data, and then they just kind of keep on going. The market at this point is not really spending a lot of time on this, even though people are getting absolutely killed by the data sets here. We did publish some efficacy rates on AV tooling, and that led to a lot of personal phone calls from EPP vendors to me saying, why would you do that? And we gave them the data set and said, we'll publish rebuttals, just let us know when, and we'll give you all the data sets you want. And it's been a year as of a couple of days ago. I got 0 back. So no, we're not seeing a lot. The EPP vendors I don't know are equipped with this stuff yet, and they're still so focused on the behavioral models and the real-time protection. And this stuff is not behavioral or real-time, so I'm not sure that it fits into the category that they would have in EPP, unfortunately. Yeah.
First of all, thank you for presenting. I really appreciated how you broke this down based on your audience. And I wanted to ask a question to add a layer to that. So as someone in the C-suite level, I imagine you do a lot of communications to the board or other stakeholders who probably aren't steeped in the weeds as much. How do you zoom out and inform executives or stakeholders who aren't as technically savvy to keep an eye out for different vulnerabilities like this?
I think I generally start with a lighter fluid and a trash can. In general, the conversations that I have, I spoke at a bank board a few months ago, and they had me in to just talk about landscape stuff. And in general, the things that I concentrate on with those groups tend to be the overarching larger topics, right? The big ones being like business email compromise, ransomware, and hygiene in your environments. And my recommendation to any organization is that they get really good at the CIS controls, the 18 CIS controls, and those are top down. They're meant to be done in order. So if you're at number 9 spending all your time on malware defense, but you don't have good asset inventory, I'm sorry, you lost. So I tend to break it down into very simple terms with CIS and say, if you're building a program or you're worried about cyber, this is the order in which you should be worried about it, and this is how you should go out and talk to the rest of your employees with it. That tends to be my pieces. To get down in the weeds on like browser extensions, they're just useless. They're not going to get there. Gonna make him run. It's perfect. I'll try and find someone way over there next.
So, I mean, every session that I've attended is like, okay, opens a world of what appears to be things that I have to do when I get back. I guess the question is, I want to just block all of this side loading in my environment, right? In the corporate environment. Is there an easy way to do that, number one? And number two, how do I quickly get into my environment, get rid of all the stuff that I don't want, which is all side-loaded? Is there a way to do that?
All right, I have 50 seconds left, and I'll answer your question. The problem is not whether you can block it or not. The problem is syncing. So if somebody is on a local machine in their environment and they sign into their home email system, by and large, it's going to sync the extensions that they've pulled from their house into your environment. That's a problem. So in general, the model is allow no extensions in an environment and run processes in the beginning to wipe all the extension directories off of boxes, and then set policies that don't allow those directories to be modified. That's probably one of the easier ways to go about sort of the totalitarian model of that. In our environment, we have 5 approved extensions. That's it. Everything else is banned. And we block access to the stores. And with that, I am out of time.
If you have further questions for Adam, you can catch him up over here off stage. Thank you guys very much for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you, Adam.